Is there a central teaching authority for Confucians or CIT?
One could argue that the social institution of the literati functioned as a central teaching authority. There is no doubt that they set up the system to which any person of talent and ambition who wished to advance would have to conform, complete with its regimen of demanding examinations, degrees, and apprenticeships. The literati system of public service also had its religious implications. Given the overall context in which traditional Chinese saw the role of the emperor, and there is no doubt that the system offered little or no flexibility, make the grade or wash out. The literati system was, therefore, a central teaching authority for a limited segment of society. Even the ordinary people in towns and villages came under at least indirect influence of the system. But the system did not make its demands on regular people the way it did on those who aspired to rise within its ranks.
Is there a central teaching authority for Confucians or CIT?
One could argue that the social institution of the literati functioned as a central teaching authority. There is no doubt that they set up the system to which any person of talent and ambition who wished to advance would have to conform, complete with its regimen of demanding examinations, degrees, and apprenticeships. The literati system of public service also had its religious implications. Given the overall context in which traditional Chinese saw the role of the emperor, and there is no doubt that the system offered little or no flexibility, make the grade or wash out. The literati system was, therefore, a central teaching authority for a limited segment of society. Even the ordinary people in towns and villages came under at least indirect influence of the system. But the system did not make its demands on regular people the way it did on those who aspired to rise within its ranks.
Is there a system of Confucian or CIT religious law?
Confucian tradition's closest analogy to the kind of religious regulation important to Jews and Muslims, for example, are the canons of ritual. It may sound at first as though Confucian law is limited to what are sometimes called rubrics. Rubrics are instructions on how to perform a ceremony, that take their name from the Latin for red, because the directions are printed in red ink to set them off from the liturgical text. But what Confucians mean by the canons of ritual actually includes an enormous range of human behavior. Here the Confucian scholars have codified ways of acting for every age and station in life. From members of the ordinary household, to the servant who prepares fruit for the emperor, to the emperor himself. These often elaborate and even somewhat theatrical stipulations might strike the outsider as extreme or downright compulsive. But the traditional interpretation is that a person of cultivated virtue will always act in such as way as to express precisely his or her relationship to those with whom he is dealing. In this way Confucian tradition preserved a definite social hierarchy still very much reflected in the formal language usage of Korea and Japan, as well as of China. Because of its unique relationship to the civil authority represented by the emperor, Confucianism as such, with its 5 classics and 4 books, did not develop a specific code of penal law. That was still largely the province of the literati as royal administrators. But it emanated from the imperial household and developed over many centuries.
Is there a system of Confucian or CIT religious law?
Confucian tradition's closest analogy to the kind of religious regulation important to Jews and Muslims, for example, are the canons of ritual. It may sound at first as though Confucian law is limited to what are sometimes called rubrics. Rubrics are instructions on how to perform a ceremony, that take their name from the Latin for red because the directions are printed in red ink to set them off from the liturgical text. But what Confucians mean by the canons of ritual actually includes an enormous range of human behavior. Here the Confucian scholars have codified ways of acting for every age and station in life. From members of the ordinary household, to the servant who prepares fruit for the emperor, to the emperor himself. These often elaborate and even somewhat theatrical stipulations might strike the outsider as extreme or downright compulsive. But the traditional interpretation is that a person of cultivated virtue will always act in such as way as to express precisely his or her relationship to those with whom he is dealing. In this way Confucian tradition preserved a definite social hierarchy still very much reflected in the formal language usage of Korea and Japan, as well as of China. Because of its unique relationship to the civil authority represented by the emperor, Confucianism as such, with its 5 classics and 4 books, did not develop a specific code of penal law. That was still largely the province of the literati as royal administrators. But it emanated from the imperial household and developed over many centuries.
Is education especially important in Confucianism?
No major religious tradition has placed greater emphasis on education than Confucianism. That is not to suggest that Confucian teaching reduces the truth to mere intellectual development. For Confucians, education goes far beyond developing mental skills and acquiring information. It means the cultivation of the whole person within the broadest possible perspective humanism under heaven. A number of very important Confucian institutions of higher learning have made major contributions throughout Asia over the centuries. Perhaps even more pervasive has been the Confucian influence in the development and maintenance of China's imperial civil service system, the educational system that produced and regulated the social class called the literati.
Is education especially important in Confucianism?
No major religious tradition has placed greater emphasis on education than Confucianism. That is not to suggest that Confucian teaching reduces the truth to mere intellectual development. For Confucians, education goes far beyond developing mental skills and acquiring information. It means the cultivation of the whole person within. The broadest possible perspective humanism under heaven. A number of very important Confucian institutions of higher learning have made major contributions throughout Asia over the centuries. Perhaps even more pervasive has been the Confucian influence in the development and maintenance of China's imperial civil service system. The educational system that produced and regulated the social class called the literati.
When were instituted the first public schools in ancient China?
The first public schools date back to ancient China. Confucius was among the first in China to advocate that primary school education should be available to all. He averred that in education there should be no class distinctions. He never refused a student even though he came to me on foot, with nothing more to offer as tuition than a package of dried meat. Confucius asserted that any man, including a peasant boy, had the potential to be a man of principle.
When were instituted the first public schools in ancient China?
The first public schools date back to ancient China. Confucius was among the first in China to advocate that primary school education should be available to all. He averred that in education there should be no class distinctions. He never refused a student even though he came to me on foot, with nothing more to offer as tuition than a package of dried meat. Confucius asserted that any man, including a peasant boy, had the potential to be a man of principle.
Is there a distinctively Confucian ethic?
A Confucian formulation of the universal golden rule at first strikes the ear as rather negative and passive. Do not do to others what you do not want done to you. But the Confucian ethic turns out to be overwhelmingly active and positive, because of its emphasis on cultivating the natural human capacity for virtue. The master's positive approach revolves around several key concepts. First and foremost is li, principle, or propriety, consisting of a whole range of directives for human behavior. Much of li arises from the customs that embody the spirit of community. When people can rely on propriety in all relationships, as enshrined in time-honored practice, they experience assurance and freedom in their relationships. Confucius gathered a huge catalogue of social rituals, not out of antiquarian curiosity, but as a way of preserving what he considered the best of tradition. Ritual propriety is not meant to confine, but to give a sense of lightness and freedom. Without Li, he thought, there can be no justice, no morality. For a society without propriety has no foundation in respect. Of equal importance is the notion of shu, reciprocity in interpersonal relationships. Reciprocity is essential to putting Li into action. For it governs the 5 principal human relationships and the 10 associated virtues. In the father-son relationship, the father must cultivate kindness, the son reverence. The elder brother must deal gently with his younger brother, who responds with respect. A mutuality of faithfulness and obedience should characterize husband-wife relationships. Let all elders be considerate of those younger, and expect deference in return. Finally, a ruler must strive to treat subjects with benevolence and benefit from their loyalty as a result.
Is education especially important in Confucianism?
No major religious tradition has placed greater emphasis on education than Confucianism. That is not to suggest that Confucian teaching reduces the truth to mere intellectual development. For Confucians, education goes far beyond developing mental skills and acquiring information. It means the cultivation of the whole person within. The broadest possible perspective humanism under heaven. A number of very important Confucian institutions of higher learning have made major contributions throughout Asia over the centuries. Perhaps even more pervasive has been the Confucian influence in the development and maintenance of China's imperial civil service system. The educational system that produced and regulated the social class called the literati.
What signs or symbols distinguish Confucian and CIT ritual specialists?
Even today, leaders of Confucian rituals are typically also government officials. When they function as ritual specialists, they don the garments once worn by representatives of the imperial household and administration. As for CIT, since there is no longer any official imperial religious worship, there are no longer CIT ritual specialists. Prior to 1911, however, CIT ritualists, from the emperor on down to the humblest assistant, simply wore the garments that signified their respective bureaucratic ranks and offices. In this case, the literati did double duty as custodians of both civil and religious ritual. For especially important events, officials wore various garments known generically as dragon robes, each decorated with emblems of the wearer's administrative rank. Imperial robes worn by the ruler during rituals were once festooned with an array of symbolic decorative motifs known collectively as the 12 ornaments, or symbols. symbolizing heaven and its wisdom, were the sun, shown with a three-legged raven inside its red disk. The blue or green moon surrounding a hair grinding. The elixir of immortality with mortar and pestle, and the constellations. Images of mountains symbolized earth and strength. Standing for all living things, the dragon symbolized resilience. The pheasant, culture and literary accomplishment. In images of bronze ritual vessels, celebrants saw filial devotion. In cereal grains, abundant harvest, in flame illumination, and in the water plant purity. Along with the mountains, the latter four also corresponded with the five elements. Finally, the fu, a geometric form meaning good fortune, and the axe, referred respectively to the imperial prerogatives of judgment and punishment. When displayed together, the 12 were done in combinations of the 5 symbolic colors associated with the 5 directions. None but the emperor's ritual vestments could depict all 12 ornaments, since they constituted a symbolic summary of the whole cosmos.
Is there a system of Confucian or CIT religious law?
Confucian tradition's closest analogy to the kind of religious regulation important to Jews and Muslims, for example, are the canons of ritual. It may sound at first as though Confucian law is limited to what are sometimes called rubrics. Rubrics are instructions on how to perform a ceremony, that take their name from the Latin for red, because the directions are printed in red ink to set them off from the liturgical text. But what Confucians mean by the canons of ritual actually includes an enormous range of human behavior. Here the Confucian scholars have codified ways of acting for every age and station in life. From members of the ordinary household, to the servant who prepares fruit for the emperor, to the emperor himself. These often elaborate and even somewhat theatrical stipulations might strike the outsider as extreme or downright compulsive. But the traditional interpretation is that a person of cultivated virtue will always act in such as way as to express precisely his or her relationship to those with whom he is dealing. In this way, Confucian tradition preserved a definite social hierarchy still very much reflected in the formal language usage of Korea and Japan, as well as of China. Because of its unique relationship to the civil authority represented by the emperor, Confucianism as such, with its 5 classics and 4 books, did not develop a specific code of penal law. That was still largely the province of the literati as royal administrators. But it emanated from the imperial household and developed over many centuries.
What is the human ideal in Confucianism?
Confucian teaching describes the epitome of the ideal society as the superior person, Junzi. That means an individual who arrives at a high level of personal development through self-discipline and inquiry. the superior person values justice more highly than profit, and prefers to be quiet and serene rather than vulgar and ungenial. Cultivating a dignified manner, the superior person nevertheless avoids arrogance. Such a person looks first to his or her personal shortcomings rather than blaming others for their lack of understanding or appreciation. It is said that the way of the superior person is a lengthy journey that begins from right here. 5 constant virtues characterize the superior person: self-respect, generosity, sincerity, responsibility, and openness to others. Expanding on the earlier teaching of Confucius, Meng Zhi taught that fully developed human life begins with 4 principles. Compassion leads to true humanity, shame leads to righteousness. Reverence and respect to propriety, and a sense of moral value to wisdom. Behind the notion of the superior person lies a deep-seated conviction of human potential for almost unlimited moral growth.
Where does academic regalia come from?
Early, every student who graduates from high school or college makes a passing connection with Confucian tradition. Academic robes with their wide flowing sleeves are at least vaguely similar to those worn by Confucian ritual leaders even today in places like Taiwan and Korea when they celebrate the master's birthday or honor royal ancestors. But one look at the headgear and the viewer knows instantly where the so-called mortar board came from. Principal participants in important Confucian rituals sport large flat rectangular boards worn with flat sides, rather than corners, as in common graduation practice now, facing the wearer's front, back, and sides. Confucian mortar boards outdid modern ones in ornamentation, with rows of tassels all along the front and back edges.
How do daists and practitioners of CCT today determine their destinies with divination?
Most common of the methods are those that involve the use of bamboo sticks and crescent-shaped blocks. In CCT temples, devotees approach a barrel crammed full of long sticks containing combinations of trigrams called hexagrams, or, alternatively, numbers from 1 to 64, the total number of combinations of the 8 trigrams. Grabbing a handful of sticks, they shake them and then let them fall back into the barrel. Invariably one stick will protrude above the rest, and it provides the critical symbol for that individual to interpret. When sticks are numbered, devotees request a corresponding slip of paper from the temple staff. On the paper they then read an often enigmatic or poetic interpretation of the corresponding hexagram. Devotees can also drop a pair of crescent-shaped blocks with one smooth side symbolizing yang and one convex side symbolizing yin. Devotees pose questions as they drop the blocks. One yang and one yin side up means yes, while the other combinations mean no. Worshippers unsatisfied with a particular answer may simply continue dropping blocks until they receive the desired response.
What kinds of special ritual objects figure in deist worship and prayer?
Specific lists of objects vary somewhat among the different schools and sects. Here are the most important ritual devices of the Celestial Masters school. First and foremost are the ubiquitous talismans that consist of a written magical formula or mantras symbolizing a contract between the deities and human beings engaging in a ritual exchange. Only a qualified ritual specialist may execute a talisman, which usually includes a specially drawn Chinese character as well as other visual symbols appropriate to a particular spiritual purpose. Possessors of talismans generally think of them as guarantees of divine aid. People wear them or hang them in home or office to attract positive energies. The precious sword of the 7 stars, symbolizing the Big Dipper, appears often in blessings and exorcisms, whether for individuals or as part of cosmic renewal observances. As a symbolic purification to the cardinal directions. Ritualists sip from a copper bowl and blow a spray through closed lips. Special stone seals of various kinds allow the specialist to make official documents such as talismans. Priests hold a stiff tablet, as if reading from a book. In exorcism rituals, black hats use the sword along with handbells, while red turbans use a horn and a whip.
What are some other important celebrations for Daoism and CCT?
Deists observe days special to the 3 officials, or officers or rulers, whom CCT call Shun, Yao, and Yu, on the 15th days of the 1st, 7th, and 10th lunar months. Their days are associated respectively with heaven, earth, and water. The heavenly official, Shun, ranks highest and remains very popular in Taiwan, for example. The water official, Yu, is celebrated for having saved the world from uncontrolled flooding. 3 deist deities considered at the pinnacle of the pantheon are known as the 3 primordials. Their festival days coincide with those of the 3 officials, respectively. The first 2 of which also coincide with the CCT Lantern Festival and Ghost Festival.
Is divination important to deists and practitioners of CCT?
Divinatory rites are more critical to Daoism and CCT than to many other major traditions. Long before Daoism came into being as a distinct set of traditions, the Chinese practiced divination through the stars, yarrow sticks, oracle bones, and tortoise shells. Important types of divination are the celestial, the terrestrial. Interpretations of events and omens, and the forecasting of individual destinies. Celestial divination, a variety of astrological interpretation. Plots the locations of stars according to one of the 12 palaces associated with the lunar month of one's birth in order to understand a host of factors including sickness and health, luck, family issues, and personality. Terrestrial divination uses an elaborate geomantic compass to assist practitioners in aligning their lives most effectively with the forces of nature. All ordinary events in the life of each person have their hidden meanings. And special divinatory skills allow one to interpret the nature of the energy played out in all events in relation to the specific time of day or year. Some events clearly have ominous qualities and require specialized interpretative skills. Thunder or lightning and other natural events suggest forces that set them aside from more mundane happenings. Perhaps the most important and widespread forms of divination are those that help people divine their personal destinies. Some focus on reading physical features, such as facial characteristics or palm lines. Here we are moving away from strictly Daoist teaching and into popular practice.
Is there such a thing as converting into Confucianism?
Since Confucian tradition has been so deeply identified with Chinese culture, the notion of converting into the tradition is virtually meaningless. That is not to say that individuals have not been so highly attracted to the teachings of the tradition that they espoused it as a philosophy of life. But so much of Confucianism is inseparable from such practices as ancestor veneration and other culturally rooted behavior, that the likelihood of conversion is very small. In addition, over the centuries most people one might identify as Confucian have more than likely been associated with other religious traditions as well, such as Daoism, CCT, or Buddhism. In Chinese religious history, and Japanese too, the more or less tidy distinctions many Europeans and Americans are used to making between religious communities simply have not been applicable.
When were instituted the first public schools in ancient China?
The first public schools date back to ancient China. Confucius was among the first in China to advocate that primary school education should be available to all. He averred that in education there should be no class distinctions. He never refused a student even though he came to me on foot, with nothing more to offer as tuition than a package of dried meat. Confucius asserted that any man including a peasant boy had the potential to be a man of principle.
What is the principal Confucian virtue?
Behind all the other virtues, what makes a good Confucian tick is filial devotion or xiao. The Chinese term is composed of sun with old placed above it. Confucius taught that all other moral virtue, and indeed civilization itself, flows from filial devotion. As a bare minimum, one should do no harm to one's parents. Filial devotion culminates in doing one's family proud. Traditional texts go into great detail about how one ought to treat parents. Summarizing ideal behavior in 5 duties: reverence always, joyful service, solicitude for ailing parents, sincere grief at a parent's death, and proper ritual veneration thereafter. Lack of filial devotion was a most serious offense. Individuals could be put to death for cursing their elders. Filial devotion was the very bedrock of social order, a fundamental acknowledgement of authority on the family level, without which there could be no exercise of authority in society at large. Chinese tradition regards society as built on the family. Sons and daughters do not go out into the world as they reach maturity. Rather than leaving the nest, they invest themselves in the family, knowing that their children will do the same. Only in that way can the foundations of society as a whole remain firm.
How do Daists worship at home and throughout the day when they are not in temples?
Worshippers perform at home many of the same rituals they perform in the temple. Home shrines or family altars are miniature versions of the temple's sacred objects. Smaller images of the various deities enjoy places of honor. Before the image, family members place a few apples or oranges, for example. And small incense pots hold small burning sticks, just as the kettle in the temple courtyard does. Many devout Chinese begin their day by offering incense to the terrestrial deity of the home, who is sometimes depicted as 5 separate figures recalling the 5 elements. This earth deity is at the bottom of an administrative flow chart, reporting to the district deity, who in turn reports to the city god, and he to the country god. Offerings to family ancestors and consultation with an almanac as to the spiritual qualities of the particular day are other regular rituals. Many private individuals still practice Tai Chi Chuan, a set of rhythmic movements designed to balance yin and yang and maximize energy.
Were any other related schools of thought important in understanding Confucianism?
Mozi, 468 to 390 BCE, started out as a Confucian but went his own way, opting for a less stratified, more egalitarian model of society. Some have characterized Mozi as a pragmatist because he insisted that observable improvement in the welfare of the populace was the ultimate criterion of good public policy. Confucius, he argued, put too much emphasis on ritual and filial devotion and too little on measurably advancing civilization. Mozi taught the importance of striving for a society united by a kind of mutual love that amounted to a form of enlightened self-interest. His school flourished for just over a century. But it offers a glimpse at one of several credible critiques of the classical Confucian approach. Another dissenting voice of Mozi's era were the legalists, Fajia. They took Mozi's critique several steps further from Confucius' global confidence that the mere example of virtuous leadership could bring about a moral conversion in society. Governance, they argued, required clear and comprehensive legislation that capitalized on people's fear of punishment and hope of reward. Confucius and Mozi clearly had greater faith in human perfectibility and in a reservoir of goodwill at the heart of humankind.
Do Confucians believe in an afterlife?
Confucius did not focus on life after death as though it were the ultimate standard against which to measure the success of a life on earth. With the majority of his fellow Chinese, the teacher shared the conviction that biological death did not signal a definitive end to life. Death did not mean annihilation and loss in some great void beyond the grave. Confucius clearly believed in some form of spiritual survival, and in the ongoing presence of those who have departed this life. Hence the importance of ancestor veneration. But like the Buddha, Confucius and his disciples chose not to speculate about possible celestial or infernal post-mortem scenarios. Daoism and CCT would offer ample options in that regard. He neither denied nor affirmed any particular views. Confucius was convinced that human beings understood far too little of life here and now to waste it planning for a hereafter they understood even less. When classical Confucian sources talk about heaven, therefore, they do not have in mind anything like a realm of eternal reward for those who die in a state of righteousness. Heaven is merely a name for the highest spiritual presence of which human beings are aware.
What have been the principal venues for Confucian communities and CIT?
Three main kinds of sacred spaces have been at the center of activities. Several kinds of venue called memorial halls enshrine the spiritual presence of great literati. Beginning with Confucius himself and his ancestors. These facilities go by the generic name Wenmiao, Temple of Literature/Culture. While those specifically dedicated to Confucius are often called Kong, or Kongzi Miao. Until at least the middle of this century, Confucian temples enjoyed prestigious locations in nearly every Chinese city as well as many Korean and some Japanese cities. In most Confucian temples, one of the more important community functions has been that of a place of study. These temples tend to draw clientele from a wider area than do CCT temples, which function more like local parishes. Unlike Buddhist and CCT temples, Confucius temples do not hum with the ritual devotions of a steady stream of worshippers. There the ritual is more likely to be quiet academic work in the side rooms provided for that purpose. Once dedicated to the reading of the Confucian classics. These rooms now provide students whose homes are crowded and noisy a chance to concentrate on any academic subject. Second in importance and number are three different types of altars for the worship of agricultural deities. Natural powers of mountain and river, and ancestral spirits. Generally set in a shared compound were the first two kinds of altar, 20-foot square platforms. Walled in and facing west. Temples of the imperial cult, finally, could be either of grand scale, as in Beijing's Temple of Heaven, or relatively humble, as in a local temple to the earth deity. All three venues provided a variety of circumstances under which communities have come together.
Have Confucians traditionally sent out missionaries to convert others?
Confucius was genuinely convinced that his ethical views and integrated approach to just government under the dominion of heaven had much to recommend them. He himself was a zealous advocate and spent much of his life trying to convert others to his interpretation of the human condition. When at length the Confucian system took hold as the theory behind the practice of imperial administration, the bureaucratic structure itself became the mechanism that spread Confucian thinking far and wide. Diplomatic relations with other lands became a network for the export of the Confucian way. But neither Confucius nor his most influential disciples were populists. Instead of preaching to the masses as missionary movements typically do, Confucians have espoused a trickle-down theory. Convince the leaders of the value of Confucianism and they in turn will spread the word to their subjects. Persuade those in authority to model the good society. Given appropriate official sanctions and incentives, the people will see the benefit of establishing proper relationships at every level.
Is exorcism important in Daoist practice?
Many Daoist rituals are designed to expel, control, or pacify troublesome spirits, or, by extension, to banish drought, famine, or outlaws who might have been plaguing the local citizenry. Daoists rarely identify individual problems as personal cases of demonic, gui, possession. Much more common are instances in which a specialist's skills are required to liberate temples, homes, and business establishments from evil influences. Until some 30 years ago, Roman Catholic tradition included a specific ritual to ordain young candidates for the priesthood to the order of exorcist, one of four so-called minor orders. Ordination to the Daoist priesthood still includes an emphasis on the ability to perform exorcism as one of its essential features. Rare descriptions of demonic possession suggest some elements similar those described in Roman Catholic archival accounts of exorcism, including the need to have several stout attendants restrain the possessed person occasionally. After performing a variety of ritual actions, such as lighting candles and incense and burning the appropriate charm, the exorcist enjoins the spirit to depart and a contest of wills ensures. More common, indeed regularly scheduled, rites of temple purification may include dramatization of an encounter between the offending demon and the deity called Chankei, dispatcher of demons. After the demon, sometimes played by a member of the temple staff or a professional actor, steals an incense burner, the priest/deity subdues the evil one and returns the stolen item to the temple gods. Only through the dominance of yang over yin can a successful exorcism be carried out. A high moment occurs as the high priest drives the evil spirit out, to the accompaniment of intense sound from percussion instruments. Another method for ridding a building of an evil presence is to create billows of holy smoke by boiling oil and adding water to it.
What is meant by the term rectification of names?
If Confucius were here today, he would surely be aghast at the way inflated language seems to have taken over ordinary conversation. I was so tired I was literally dead on my feet. No, you weren't, he might say. Drop the literally and your expression will have far more impact, even though your surrounding culture insists that more is better. He would be amazed to hear restaurant staff introduce themselves as your food and beverage counselor, or hear store cashiers and stockers identified as sales associates and inventory specialists. But Confucius would worry less about such trivial matters than about the very same deep social issues he agonized over in his own time. When a man fails to show respect to his parents, do not call him a son. If he fails to guide his children, he is unworthy to be called a father. If a woman does not attend to her family faithfully, one can hardly call her a wife or mother. If a man is unfaithful to his wife, do not call him a husband. Of greatest political import is his insistence that no unjust ruler deserves the name emperor. Beneath this apparently nitpicking criticism, Confucius was getting at a profound truth: over the long haul, imprecise speech allows injustice to go unnoticed because it can be hidden behind acceptable names. Euphemism can erode one's sense of right and wrong and desensitize a person to violence. Eventually we persuade ourselves that misspeaking is not a lie, or that stealing is nothing more than the redistribution of wealth. Confucius believed that language matters because it not only reflects, but can even change, the way we think.
Are there any signs or symbols that might identify an individual as a Confucian?
Confucian tradition consists far more of actions and the preservation of proper relationships than on the expression of specific doctrines. The tradition so pervades Chinese and other Asian cultures that it is like the air one breathes, rather than a distinct set of beliefs. As a result, it is virtually impossible to tell who among Chinese, Japanese, or Koreans think of themselves as Confucians. There are still some people who identify themselves as disciples of the master, but they are relatively few in number. Since so many rituals that Chinese and other East Asians perform are common to members of various religious traditions, the fact that an individual practiced ancestor veneration, for example, offers no clues in this regard. There are, however, a number of symbols connected with daily life originally associated with Confucius that still appear in popular arts of Asia. The so-called four treasures of the literary apartment, for example, include an ink stick, ink block, brush, and paper.
What is the basic Confucian concept of appropriate moral leadership?
Confucius believed that order was essential for bringing out the best in human beings. He and his disciples rejected the early deist notions that all things work for the best if only people learn the ways of nature and that there is no need for government or military force or oppressive laws. In Confucius' view, government was essential, and that almost always required bureaucratic structures. But he believed the external trappings had to be supported by a foundation of example rather than coercion. No one can bring about the good society by force of will. One can only foster appropriate government by creating an environment of propriety, reciprocity, and good music. Yes, good music. Law, he believed, can erode moral values because people often prefer to act a certain way merely to escape punishment. The example of a great leader is preferable, for it instills a sense of healthy shame that leads people to seek improvement. Confucius was a realist, however, and conceded that law was often a practical necessity. What he wanted for the people most of all was the sense of confidence that can grow when people feel prosperous and educated. A good leader knows how to bring out the best in his people and how to wield authority deftly. But as a concession to the vast differences among human beings, government needs levels of power. Some can lead, some can support a leader, some can follow but may not understand why they ought to do so. A leader knows how to cultivate conditions conducive to the betterment of society by tapping the roots of human resources rather than waiting until the plant is fully grown and incapable of nurturance.
Do millennialism or messianism have a place in Confucian thinking?
Confucius was far more concerned about the present and its relation to the past than about possible but distant futures. He was keenly interested in offering people hope through the cultivation of a balanced society. Some have suggested that Confucius was very much a utopian, in that the society he sought to foster was destined to remain an unattainable ideal. In any case, Confucius did not envision any kind of inevitable cataclysm. An end of time at which the world of history would implode in a cosmic conflagration. Confucian thought has been intimately associated with the traditional Chinese reckoning of time. That includes cycles of 60 years, but those cycles do not carry apocalyptic implications. There have been millennialist and messianic movements in Chinese history, but none of importance has arisen out of Confucian or literati circles. However, some scholars detect in Confucian history elements that have a messianic tone. According to that view, Confucius himself may have fulfilled expectations of a messianic ruler nurtured as far back as the legendary Shang dynasty.
What gender-related issues have been important in Confucianism and CIT?
Confucian tradition emphasized social order, and that called for clearly delineated gender functions. Given the conviction that only a patriarchal structure could guarantee social order, what many people today call social equality was simply not included in the Confucian lexicon. Confucian teaching envisioned male-female relationships according to a political model. First and foremost among questions of gender are those relating to family structure and roles. But whether within the family or in society at large, women and younger people generally shared the expectation of dutiful obedience. Women remained in the home to serve the family, which sometimes brought as many as 4 generations together in one household. Widows were typically expected not to remarry. When a wife produced no son, a husband could marry one or more secondary wives in the hope of securing a male heir. A telling fact is that no women are numbered among the great sages and scholars memorialized in Confucius temples. In the imperial household, there were sometimes several empresses and many royal concubines. An empress remained out of view for the most part, participating in a few affairs of state annually. Eunuchs looked after the harem, strictly organizing the lives of all women in the imperial household.
Is meditation important in Daoism or CCT?
Dominant forms of devotional expression in CCT tend to be associated with more extroverted ritual and supplicatory prayer. Classical and later Daoist sources, on the other hand, describe various meditative methods designed to help the practitioner turn inward. In fact, Chan Buddhism, the Chinese precursor to the more famous Japanese Zen, seems to have borrowed much from Daoism in this respect. The meditator sits and forgets in the presence of nature, engaging in the fast of the mind. Principal stages in Daoist meditative technique are the following. First, the meditator calms the body by adopting a fixed posture and slow, regular breathing. As the meditator becomes one with his or her breathing, distractions begin to dissolve. To develop greater concentration, the meditator chooses a specific symbolic focus for detailed visualization. In the next stage, the meditator moves beyond this discursive intellectualizing into the fast of the mind. Leaving behind all symbols and ideas, the meditator enters a realm where images are irrelevant. Finally, the meditator loses all sense of self and attains union with the Deo.
What rites do worshippers practice in Daoist and CCT temples?
One of the most important and easily observable temple rituals involves the offering of incense. Worshippers buy 3 slender sticks of incense at a small temple shop that supplies a variety of materials for different sorts of offerings. Devotees can make their offerings either at the main altar or at any of a number of side or subordinate altars. Depending on the size of the temple and which deity they choose to address. Those who wish to worship at the main shrine may first approach the large incense kettle that normally stands in the central courtyard. Igniting their incense sticks, they hold them upright between folded hands. Wave them before the deity, and bow from the waist toward the object of their devotion. After prayer they insert the handles of the burning incense wands into the sand and ashes in the kettle. On some occasions a devotee might have his or her sticks placed in a holder on an altar. Some take incense ash home for use as a curative medicine. Equally important is a more ritually generic type of devotional prayer in which devotees supplicate the various deities for favors. Worshippers generally kneel to address the chosen deity. Praying either aloud or in silence, either bowing humbly or looking at the image. Offerings other than incense include a variety of foods. Most commonly fruits, rice, vegetables, wine, and sweets. When worshippers make such offerings, they often have a temple staff member light a candle for them on the altar. Toward the end of a typical episode of temple worship, devotees will burn symbolic imitation paper money as an offering. All temples provide one or more small furnaces in which worshippers offer gold paper to the deities and silver to ancestors. These burnt offerings symbolize personal sacrifice in hope of blessing and commitment to the ongoing well-being of departed family members.
Is there such a thing as Confucian fundamentalism?
Confucian scholars have devised a wide range of methods for interpreting the classical sources. Many of the central concepts in Confucian thought are simply too large and subtle to interpret literally. Take the notion of the mandate of heaven, for example. Dynasties have come and gone frequently in China's long history, and many have interpreted dynastic decay as a sure indication that the emperor had lost his contact with heaven's will. That is an easy enough judgment to make in retrospect. But using the mandate theory as a criterion for deciding whether the people are justified in bringing down this regime now is a much more complicated matter. Some interpreters have chosen to apply the criteria of the classical sources directly to current events. They have their Christian counterparts, for example. In those who have discerned portents of the apocalypse in the world around them at various times in history. Some Confucian texts have lent themselves more readily to literal interpretation. So much so that their prescriptions have become the very fabric of life for countless Chinese who have never set foot in a Confucian temple. Those are books like the Religie, with its detailed descriptions of ritualized relationships across the full spectrum of human activity.
Is there a distinctively Confucian interpretation of history?
Confucius refused to think of himself as an innovator. Any individual bent on inventing his own system of thought was doomed to failure. So interdependent are we humans. His task, he believed, was what he called the renewal of antiquity. His first step was to translate his knowledge of tradition into clearly articulated principles, so that he could intelligently sort out the best of the past. Confucius discerned in the drift of history a serious problem of societal entropy, the tendency to let things unravel. Looking back to the legendary founders of Chinese society, Confucius believed the first major problem set in when the Xia dynasty, 1994 to 1525 BCE, instituted the principle of hereditary succession. When decline in the quality of the rulers reached a disastrous low. The Shang dynasty, 1525 to 1028 BCE, overthrew the last Xia tyrant. Unfortunately, the Shang rulers retained the hereditary throne, thus virtually sealing their own eventual demise. Sure enough, the Zhou dynasty, 1028 to 222 BCE, was destined to be the instrument of renewal. By the master's own time, the Zhou, too, showed signs of serious decay. The master wondered what power under heaven might again correct the course of history. Confucius was convinced that it was possible to imitate the eternally true in history, to avoid reliving all of the past by distinguishing the good from the evil in it. True authority arose out of the ability to blend the ancient with the new. And only through learning could a leader assimilate the eternally true to changing needs. Beginning with politics and ethics, Confucius set out to contribute to the renewal of antiquity.
Are there any Confucian or CIT holy sites or cities?
Confucian tradition spotlights a number of places associated with the lives of Confucius and other major sages and scholars. Only a year after Confucius' death, the Duke of Lu dedicated a temple to him in Khufu, 478 BCE. Within a few years, his tomb and temple in Khufu had become widely known holy places. As early as 195 BCE, an imperial sacrifice at the tomb further broadened Khufu's fame as a sacred site. Confucian tradition did not elevate any one city to prominence as a center of authoritative teaching. But certain cities were home to the great Confucian universities. The most important cities were always associated with the seat of imperial government. And that changed often through Chinese history, even during the tenure of a single dynasty. Beijing has been perhaps the most important Confucian city. It was the capital uninterruptedly for nearly 500 years. And Confucianism was highly favored and influential through virtually that whole period.
Is there a standard Daoist group liturgical worship?
Most of the ritual activity one can observe at temples. Throughout the day consists of individual or family worship. At various times during the day, members of pious organizations may gather for group chanting of liturgical prayers. The priest may address a sermon to such gatherings as well. Major Daoist sects have devised their own special communal rituals. And some have survived intact into our time and are still practiced, especially in rural areas and more traditional villages. Many of these involve group chanting of sacred texts. In imitation of the chanting of the assembled gods themselves when they created the universe. One important communal ritual is that based on the teachings of the Lingbao sect. Elaborate theatrical liturgies address issues and powers in 3 levels or registers: the celestial, the terrestrial, and the human. The golden register of rituals honors the family of the emperor at the celestial level. A terrestrial level called the yellow register is aimed at peaceful rest for the deceased. The now discontinued jade register once focused on securing salvation for all people. The officiants and their ritual implements mediate between the divine and human participants. Rites once dedicated to the emperor and his court are now undertaken on behalf of local or family groups known to uphold religious standards. Observances begin with an evening or vespers prayer to announce the start of the rituals and symbolically reconstruct a sacred realm in which to enact the rites. Great attention goes into setting the ritual scene. A miniature of the cosmos with gates at the 4 cardinal directions. Action resumes the next morning with a fast and an offering. Imitating a creative divine act, the officiant recreates the sacred space by pacing out creation and journeys symbolically to the heavens to bring down heavenly powers. As part of the ritual, the master, or priest, meditates silently, focusing on visual imagery as a way of bringing health to the assembled people. The entire ritual ends on the next day with the master facing the assembly as one now returned to earth. He then dismantles the altar, burns the sacred texts, and sends the deities back to their heavenly abodes.
How would you sum up Confucianism's historical relationships to other traditions?
Confucianism's most important and enduring interreligious relations have been with Buddhism and Taoism. There have been periods during which Confucians have had more or less cordial dealings with representatives of the other two ways of China. But since so much has often been at stake, especially in terms of imperial patronage, Confucian scholars have frequently leveled serious criticisms at Taoist and Buddhist views. For example, Confucians have sometimes faulted Buddhism for being too otherworldly, too disconnected from the ordinary problems and needs of regular people. Confucians generally interpreted the Buddhist ideal of celibate monastic life as an abdication of filial devotion and the responsibility to perpetuate the family lineage. Taists, on the other hand, have characteristically struck Confucians as naive in their conviction that, if left to themselves, people will naturally follow an exemplary leader. Taoism's emphasis on doing things nature's way leaves society too vulnerable to simple lawlessness. In addition, the Confucian tradition's strong emphasis on education seemed to many to be irreconcilable with Taoism's more organic and seemingly anti-intellectual approach to learning. When Confucian tradition began to come into prominence during Japan's Tokugawa era, it found an increasingly hostile official response from representatives of Shinto. Confucianism, Shinto authorities argued, was a non-Japanese influence and therefore undesirable. By that time, however, Confucius had already made an indelible impression on Japanese society.
Have there been any sub-communities or denominations within Confucianism?
An early historian of Confucian tradition, Lu Xiang, 77–6 BCE, claimed that by his time the Confucians had divided into 103 schools of thought, each defined by its distinctive manner of interpreting the essential texts. Whether that was literally the case or not, it is clear that during the Song and later dynasties, several important schools developed within the larger phenomenon called Neo-Confucianism. The two main branches became known as the School of Principle and the School of Mind. According to their respective theoretical points of departure, the School of Principle, Li Shui, was also called the Chengzu School. Combining the first names of the men it claims as its founders, Chen Yi, 1033–1107, and his brother Cheng Hao, 1032–85, and the later Zhu Shi, 1130–1200. The brothers Cheng developed a sophisticated theory in which principle Li meant not the classical Confucian rites and canons of social propriety, but an unchanging universal law inherent in all nature. Zhu Shi further refined that concept of principle, defining it as the great ultimate from which all forces in nature emerge. In what one might call a variety of process theology, Zhu Shi argued that the path to ethical development was the investigation of things. The other major branch of Neo-Confucian thinking was known as the School of Mind, Xin Shui. Wang Yangming, 1472–1529, was one of the school's leading lights. Principle, he argued, was not merely a transcendent and inaccessible cosmic force, but was one with the human mind. He taught that one could cultivate good conduct through reverent seriousness, a type of meditative discipline through which one could realize the unity of mind and principle.
What is the link between Feng Shui and Daoism?
Feng Shui, a term meaning wind and water, is a type of terrestrial divination designed to help practitioners make practical decisions about living arrangements that will be in harmony with natural energies and forces. This symbolic system coordinates critical elements of time and space to allow for maximum harmony in every conceivable human interaction with nature. All natural features, including trees, rivers, mountains, and valleys, for example, have their distinctive influences on the flow of energy. Failure to take of these forces into account can make life much more difficult than it need be. In practical terms, Feng Shui assists people most of all in choosing the orientation and design of the built environment, in other words, architecture and urban planning. A geomantic compass allows people to arrange the spaces in which they live and work in accordance with the principle of the 9 palaces. The compass indicates where yin and yang energies flow. A grid of 9 squares, each of which contains 3 numbers from 1 to 9. Can be used in connection with building plans to indicate optimum placement of particular kinds of spaces within a home or office, e.g. storage, study, eating, or sleeping spaces. This ancient environmentalist system has grown from careful observation of the consequences of human interaction with the greater cosmos. Chinese tradition emphasizes the need to conform with the way of nature rather than attempting to dominate it.